We're continuing on Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim. Siman Kuf Lamed Chet is what we're starting today. Sif Aleph and Daf Chaf Amud Bet of the regular prints of Mishna Berura. And this comes straight from the Gemara in Masechet Megillah, Daf Chaf Aleph. The Gemara says, "Hakoreh b'Torah lo yishayer beparasha pachot mishlosha psukim." When you are reading a parasha, you do not want to leave in a parasha pachot mishlosha psukim. You don't want to read until almost the end of the parasha and leave just one pasuk or just two psukim. The minimum that you want to leave off is 3 psukim, mipenei yotzim as mi bet knesset, because people who are leaving the bet knesset at the time, that they should not think to themselves that there is going to be an aliyah afterwards, and the next aliyah is only getting 2 psukim. So people would deduce from that, you could have an aliyah with 2 psukim. So that's something that we will be mindful of not to do. Also, you do not want to start in a parasha less than 3 psukim in from the beginning of the parasha, because the person that comes into the shul suddenly and doesn't know that this is the aliyah that was read before is the first aliyah, he may think, they started from the 3rd pasuk of the parasha, must be there was an aliyah before, that the person only got 2 psukim as aliyah. So the same problem would apply over there as well. The misunderstandings that could happen in Kriyat Torah, when you're dealing with a broader community, we become extremely mindful of not letting room for any mistakes, any misunderstandings, because the people who enter, they'll say, the first person must have read only 2 psukim, so hence we try to stay away from any possibility of misunderstandings. The Rama adds, there's no difference if the parasha that you're starting is an obvious new parasha or is less obvious, because in the Sefer Torah you have some parashiyot that are ptuchot, that means it's a new paragraph, and you have a parasha stuma that the new paragraph starts within this same line, so it will be less obvious. And if you have a parasha that only has 2 psukim altogether, you could stop by that parasha, because no one is going to make that mistake. And the parashiyot that you read, the paragraphs, the psukim that you read for every oleh, for every person that gets an aliyah, certain amount of ishtadlut should be done, says the Rama, that you start with a good topic and you end with a good topic. Likro b'davar tov, yatchil likro b'davar tov, v'yisayem b'davar tov. You start with the good, you end with the good. Ve'ayin lekaman siman taf chaf chet, and that is going to be discussed right at the end of Rosh Chodesh, right before the Chod Pesach. Later on in Shulchan Aruch says the Mishnah Berura, לא ישייר, היינו שלא יסיים לשום אחד מהעולים סמוך להתחלת הפרשה. Any of the olim that get up to have an aliyah, you don't want to finish the reading of the Torah 1 pasuk before the end of parasha, 2 psukim before the end of the parasha, because of the people who may misunderstand as they go out of the shul and think that the next person is going to get only 2 psukim, and therefore it would be the right thing to stay at least 3 psukim away from the end of the parasha. And again, when we talk about parasha, the Rama Mipano, Rabbi Menachem Azaria Mipano, he explains that parasha is from language of prisha. That means you're stopping, you're cutting it off over there. The HaKadosh Baruch Hu cut off his speech with Moshe. The Torah is written in parashiyot. That those are the things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would teach to Moshe Rabbeinu at one shot, and then would give revach for him to think and to internalize what he learned, and then the next. So that's when we talk about parasha. It's not talking about parasha Shavua. Parasha just means where you cut off something. That's what it means, and for our purposes, it's talking about any of the hefseks, any of the parashiyot stumot or ptuchot in the Chumash. Now says the Mishnah Berura, "Velo ma she'haolam korim parasha haynu shni shlishi." We're not talking about the sheni v'shlishi where the aliyot end. We're talking about where the Chumash has a parasha stuma or parasha ptucha, a beginning of the new chapter, or beginning of any of the paragraphs in the Torah. People were going to think that you could read a aliyah less than 3 psukim. And what happens if you did the mistake? The Baal Koreh made a mistake, because you don't always have a tikkun korim in front of you to see how the parasha stuma ends. So if you made a mistake, if you did that mistake, and the person that got the aliyah already said the bracha v'asher natan lanu, then isalik inyana kikon beparashat hamoadot, if the whole topic is finishing, like parashat hamoadot, shta'a b'rivi'i, you made a mistake in aliyat revi'i, and you left only 2 psukim at the end, matchil im hachamishi pasuk echad lemafreya, then you go back 1 pasuk, and you read 3 psukim until the end of the parasha. Ve'ilo salik inyanan, if the topic is not finishing, then you don't need to necessarily go backwards 1 pasuk. You just start from where he ended. You read those 2 psukim, you end the parasha. And you will start the new parasha at least with 3 psukim or maybe more afterwards, and that would be the basic halacha. Now, same thing is with when you have a ta'ut in a Sefer Torah. If you find a mistake that passes the Sefer Torah, and you have to now take out the new Sefer Torah in middle of the aliyah, so you go back, the halacha is you go back to the place of the ta'ut. From that pasuk and on, you read it. The Kaf HaChaim writes that if the pasuk that you had a mistake in is the pasuk right before the end of a parasha, 1 pasuk or 2 psukim before the end of the parasha, then you don't go back to read more psukim from the second sefer. What you do is you start the pasuk where the mistake was, you finish those 2 psukim until the end of the parasha, and then you read another 3 psukim or more from the upcoming parasha, and that would be the halacha. And we said in the Shulchan Aruch, that you shouldn't start less than 3 psukim either. This way, you don't end the previous aliyah 1 pasuk into the new parasha, or 2 psukim into the new paragraph, and this way the next ole is starting 1 or 2 psukim in to the new parasha. Someone that enters the shul at that moment says, he started from the 2nd or 3rd pasuk. That means the previous guy only got 1 or 2 psukim as an aliyah. So that's again the mistake that we want to avoid, the misunderstanding that we want to avoid. And therefore, we don't start a parasha rather, a pasuk or 2 psukim in. Either you have to start the parasha from the beginning, or from the 4th pasuk after the start. Doesn't make a difference. Even if you have a mosif, the mosifin also should be keeping this halacha in mind. Even the maftir cannot be violating these rules. So there's something important for the Gabbai to be mindful, especially those kihilot that they have more musifim, that you're going off script. Basically, you're not just stopping by the aliyot, but you are creating your own aliyot over here. Especially those who, when they have a lot of musifim, they try to give 3 psukim to every one of the olim. So they divide shishi to many different aliyot. So they have to be mindful not to violate these halachot of the Shulchan Aruch. Now, all of this is lachatchila, but b'di'evet, if you did it, it's fine. You don't have to go back or anything. If you already made a mistake and you finished 2 psukim after the beginning of the parasha, and you said the bracha, then the second guy just starts from the beginning of the parasha. It's fine. It's not. You go back to the beginning of the parasha, you read again those 2 psukim, and that would be an easy fix for it. Now, we mentioned in the Ramah that if the parasha she'ena rak shne psukim, if you have only 2 psukim in a parasha, you could leave it, which means you could just end by the beginning of that parasha. No one is going to think that the next aliyah is going to be only 2 psukim, because they realize the whole parasha is only 2 psukim, and therefore there's not really that much room for marit ayin, for the mistake to happen. And says the Mishna Berura, this that you have to start and stop by a positive note. Bedavar tov shel Yisrael, the tovat ovet gilulim ena kruya tova. We're talking about positive note for the Jews. If you have something that's talking about positivity for Ovdei Kochavim, that's not what we are talking about. And also, not to end with davar ra, with something negative. We're talking also about Israel, not necessarily Oved Kochavim. So if you have a defeat on the Goyim's part, so to speak, that's not considered davar ra, that's actually a davar tov. Kata b'Sefer Chasidim, Rabbi Yehuda Chasid, in his Sefer Chasidim, in Siman Tafshin Samech Chet, writes, Yizaher HaChazan shlo yikra lemi shehu iver o piseach beparashat everet o shabur. The Gabbai should be careful not to call a blind person or someone that is blemished to the parasha of averet or shavur, that talks about the parasha that talks about blindness or being a lame person, or lemisha berosho netek parashat netakim, someone that has that issue that the parasha talks about, that blemish that the parasha is talking about. Also, you should not call up to the Torah someone that there is suspicion on him in Yanei Arayot, in the area of promiscuity, Parashat Arayot. You should not be called up to the Torah in Parashat Arayot. And the same thing is with every other issue as well. And that's, again, sensitivities that you have to have as a Gabbai. And the Knesset Gdolah, Rab Chaim ben Yisrael ben Beneshti, he writes that these are only, when we talk about Chashud al Arayot, someone that is suspected on promiscuity, it's only when you don't know if something has actually happened. But if it's a person that people know that he's involved with promiscuity, then on the contrary, you want him to be embarrassed. You want him to be embarrassed. You get him Parashat Arayot, so we know what you do, so to speak, type of thing. He should be embarrassed of himself with what he does, and also that he should be read to and explained how chamur these averot are when the Torah talks about the consequences of these areas of averah. But if someone is we don't know, it's just a suspicion, you don't want to give in to that suspicion by calling them up and embarrassing them publicly. That's something that you have to be mindful of. And same is with a person that has a blemish. You don't want them to feel self-conscious and embarrassed and uncomfortable publicly up there by the Torah when you give them a parasha that talks about that issue that they have. But Reb Chaim Pelagi writes that if you have an aliyah that talks about promiscuity and you give it to this person and he's going to be changing colors up there, turning white and black and all the colors in the book, such a halbanat panim, such a public shaming, and you don't even know if he's going to get chizuk from it necessarily to do tshuva, but maybe he's going to actually become worse. Says Reb Chaim Pelagi, don't do it. Don't do it. If you're going to publicly embarrass somebody like that, and you don't even know if it's going to work. It used to be that people, when they were confronted with something wrongdoing that they did, they would do tshuva. I remember Rabbi Eliezer ben David, alav shalom, he told me once, he said, used to be a generation that when the Chacham would darshin, every person in the kahal would say, oh, he's speaking to me, I have to fix myself. They would take it very personally, very seriously, and they would grow from it. Then came a generation, he said, that Chacham says Musar, and everyone is thinking he's talking to him. Talking to him. I says now it's a generation that Chacham gives Musar, everyone in the Kahal says, he's talking to me, how dare he's talking to me? It's the exact opposite reaction. So that is not necessarily a good thing, says Reb Chaim Pelagi. You have to really know your people, you really have to know your community. And if you think that there's going to be publicly shamed like that, especially a person that's very self-conscious, very bashful in that way, and you're not going to publicly now embarrass him, and he's going to get completely turned off and not do tshuva at all, perhaps not a mitzvah really to do that. You have to be careful and mindful of all the sensitivities that gets into the 5th volume of Shulchan Aruch, of having the chokhmah, the insight and the foresight to make the right decision at the time. And if you have a person that eats chadash, right, does not keep yashan. Now yashan is perhaps a issue that's biblical according to most of the Rishonim, even in Chutz La'aretz. So you have somebody that does not keep yashan or doesn't write prusbul on Shnat HaShemitah to make sure that his loans are good and he could collect his debts after Shvi'id. Then the Ben Ish Chai writes in Rav Pa'alim and the Kaf HaChaim as well that you should not give him, this is Chatam Sofer, others as well, that you should not give him parasha that talks about Yashan. That parasha that talks about Isur Chadash, that you should not give to a person that does not keep Yashan, right? And again, if you live in a country, in a place that if you don't give them the aliyah, is going to be a fight in the community and machloket and so on, of course, you will give the aliyah to him, and it will be better to avoid any machloket than being mindful of this thing that's l'chatchila. And one last thing over here in this saif. Says the Mishna Berura, in everything you have to be mindful not to embarrass people by giving them things that is their area of challenge and blemish, physical or otherwise. And the Chazan has to be very careful, the Baal Koreh, not to think personal when he gives brachot, to give when you're reading the brachot of the Torah, that it should be having kavanah for a certain individual, or chas v'shalom, to give a curse when you're reading the klalot to somebody, and that's something very important, because the Baal Koreh's job is to read the Torah lishma, not for any outside machshava or ulterior motive. So therefore, you have to be very careful. There are people who say Sefer Torah is bodek, he checks the person, and they have all kinds of lachashim that they read, and they say, well, if this guy got this aliyah, happened to be this aliyah, that means that he does this avera. That the chas v'shalom, to say such a thing is avon gadol, tremendous sin. To think like that or to imply these types of things, you have to be very careful. And again, a person that has thoughts of giving bracha to his friend, when he's reading the brachot of the Torah, he's not reading it for people. He's reading for his friend. He's using it as a tefillah, not as kriyat Torah. And therefore, some achronim in Sefer Shtilei Zatim, for instance, he says, "You're not yotzeh without kriyat Torah." Yeah, the person that's the Baal Koreh, his job is to read the Torah for the tzibur as a mitzvah of kriyat Torah. Vezehu, that's it. Nothing more and nothing less. And you should end with davar tov. You should end with good thing as well. Ve'en lesayim b'mi she'asa ma'asera. Says the Mishnah Berura, you should not end it with someone that did something negative, something bad. And again, if you are one of the olim, one of the people who got an aliyah, and they stopped it for you in a negative note, then in Sefer Chaim writes that you shouldn't complain really, and cause machloket and cause the shaliach tzibur to add more psukim. You just let it go. These are things that are lechatchila. You don't have to be very specific and very exacting about them. And ending with the one word, that the word itself is not necessarily a good connotation, even though that the inyan is good, the topic generally is good. For instance, it says, Orerecha arur. Ve'orachecha baruch ve'orerecha arur. So the last word is arur, cursed. But the context is that your people who curse you should be cursed, which is very positive. So that, now the Ben Ish Chai says there's no chashash in this. There's no problem with that. We go on after the context, not after the specific pasuk, and that concludes our seif and our siman over here. Bezrat Hashem will continue in the days to come. Chazak u'baruch.